Black Maid's Gourmet cooking stuns wealthy family, changes her fate forever. The elegant dining room fell silent. Crystal glasses stopped mid-clink. 7 pairs of wide eyes stared at Dorothy Wilson, who stood frozen in the doorway, still wearing her maid's uniform, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Senator James Harrison slowly rose from his seat at the head of the table, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. The distinguished dinner guests, including the governor and his wife, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "You're telling me," Senator Harrison said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that you prepared this entire meal, that my chef had nothing to do with it?" Dorothy swallowed hard, her throat dry. At 62, after decades of working in wealthy homes, she had never been in a situation like this. She looked at Mrs. Harrison, whose expression was unreadable. "Yes, sir," Dorothy finally said. "Mr. Laurent, he collapsed in the kitchen. Food poisoning, I think. There wasn't time to call anyone else." She straightened her shoulders. "I couldn't let you be embarrassed in front of the governor." The senator's daughter, Catherine, stood up suddenly, knocking over her wine glass. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood. "Dad, you can't possibly," she began, but the senator silenced her with a raised hand. The governor broke the tense silence. "Harrison, this is the finest meal I've had in 20 years of political dinners." He turned to Dorothy. "Who taught you to cook like this, ma'am?" Before Dorothy could answer, Mrs. Harrison spoke. "James, there's something you need to know, something I've kept from you for 30 years. She looked directly at Dorothy, tears forming in her eyes. "Something that changes everything. But let's go back to how this all started." It was just 3 hours earlier when Dorothy arrived at the Harrison mansion for what she thought would be a typical evening of service. The sprawling Georgian-style home sat on 5 acres in the wealthiest part of town, its manicured lawns and gardens a testament to the senator's success. Dorothy had worked for the Harrisons for nearly 7 years now, longer than any other staff member except for Mr. Laurent, the French chef who had been with the family for decades. Dorothy parked her old Buick, a 1975 model she'd maintained meticulously, in the staff area behind the garage. As she walked toward the service entrance, she adjusted her uniform, making sure everything was in place. At her age, with her knees aching from years of standing, she sometimes wondered how much longer she could do this work. But the Harrisons paid well, and she needed the money to help her grandson through college. "Evening, Dorothy," said Frank, the groundskeeper, who was finishing up his day's work. Frank had fought in Vietnam and still jumped at loud noises. They'd formed a quiet friendship over the years. "Evening, Frank. Looks like rain tonight." "My niece says you're right about that," he chuckled, rubbing his leg. "Big dinner tonight, I hear," Dorothy nodded. "The governor and some other VIPs. Mr. Laurent's been cooking since dawn, I expect." She entered through the kitchen door and found exactly what she'd expected, a whirlwind of activity. Mr. Laurent, a tall, thin man with a perpetually worried expression, was directing 2 kitchen assistants while simultaneously checking something in the oven. "Ah, Dorothy, thank heavens," Laurent exclaimed when he saw her. "The senator wants everything perfect tonight. The governor, his wife, the state attorney general, and some campaign donors will be here." He wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Harrison said to tell you to use the good silver and the Wedgwood china." Dorothy hung up her coat and got to work setting the formal dining room. She knew exactly which silver the senator's wife meant, the sterling set that had belonged to Mrs. Harrison's grandmother, only used for the most important occasions. As she arranged the place settings with practiced precision, she could hear Catherine, the Harrisons' 30-year-old daughter, arguing with someone on the phone in the adjacent room. Catherine had moved back home 6 months ago after her divorce, and her presence had created tension in the household. "I don't care what he says," Catherine's voice carried clearly. "The trust fund is mine, and I'll use it how I want." Dorothy kept her expression neutral, as she'd learned to do over decades of service in wealthy homes. It wasn't her place to have opinions about family matters. Still, she'd watched Catherine grow up, and it pained her to see the once sweet girl so bitter now. She finished with the dining room and returned to the kitchen to help with final preparations. That's when she noticed Mr. Laurent looked unusually pale. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked him as he leaned heavily against the counter. "Just a little tired," he said, but then winced and pressed a hand to his stomach. "Perhaps something I ate earlier." "You should sit down for a minute," Dorothy suggested. Laurent shook his head. "No time." The soufflés must go in exactly 17 minutes before serving, and the sauce, he suddenly doubled over, groaning. Dorothy helped him to a chair. "You need to lie down. Where are your assistants?" "Sent them to get more fresh herbs," Laurent gasped. "The governor's wife is allergic to the dried ones." Dorothy felt his forehead. "You're burning up. I'm calling Mrs. Harrison." Before she could reach for the house phone, Laurent grabbed her wrist. The dinner, he pleaded. The senator's campaign depends on impressing these people. He'll lose the election if tonight goes poorly. But you can't cook in this condition, Dorothy said. Lawrence's face had taken on a greenish tinge. Call the agency, get another chef. Dorothy checked the kitchen clock, 5:47 p.m. Guests would arrive at 7:00. There's no time, she said. That's when Mrs. Harrison walked in, elegant in a blue evening dress. She stopped short when she saw Laurent. What's happening? He's ill, ma'am, Dorothy explained. Food poisoning, I think. Mrs. Harrison's composed facade cracked for just a moment. Tonight of all nights, she pressed her fingers to her temples. The senator needs this dinner to go perfectly. The governor is announcing his endorsement afterward. Dorothy watched as Mrs. Harrison, Catherine Elizabeth Harrison, born to wealth and married to more of it, briefly closed her eyes, calculating options. When those eyes opened again, they fixed on Dorothy with unexpected intensity. Can you cook, Dorothy? Mrs. Harrison asked. The question hung in the air between them. Dorothy had been cooking since she was tall enough to reach a stove, learning at her grandmother's side in rural Georgia. Before working as a maid, she had been a cook for the Jenkins family for 12 years. But the Harrisons had never asked about her cooking skills. They'd hired her to clean and serve. Yes, ma'am, I can cook, Dorothy answered simply. But not like this, Laurent protested weakly, gesturing to his elaborate preparations. No offense, Dorothy, but this menu requires classical training. Mrs. Harrison looked at the clock. We have no choice. Dorothy, what can you prepare in? She checked her diamond watch. Just over an hour. Dorothy surveyed the kitchen. Laurent had already prepared some elements, but the main courses were still raw or unassembled. She thought quickly. I can do a 3-course meal, ma'am. Not what was planned, but something that won't embarrass the senator. Mrs. Harrison hesitated, then nodded sharply. Do it. I'll have my husband's assistant call Dr. Stevens for Laurent. She turned to leave, then paused. Dorothy, the senator doesn't need to know about this change until after dinner. Understood? Yes, ma'am. As Mrs. Harrison helped Laurent to the staff room to lie down, Dorothy took a deep breath and rolled up her sleeves. She opened the refrigerator and pantry, assessing what she had to work with. Her mind raced through recipes she hadn't prepared in years, recipes her grandmother had taught her, dishes she'd perfected in her own kitchen, specialties from her time cooking professionally. She began working with swift efficiency, her hands remembering what her mind had filed away. For the first course, she would prepare a chilled soup, simple but elegant. The main course would be her grandmother's special roast chicken with herbs and a sauce she'd learned to make during her time with the Jenkins family. Dessert would be a peach cobbler with bourbon vanilla cream, a recipe that had won her first place at the county fair back in 1976. As she worked, Dorothy lost herself in the familiar rhythms of cooking. This was something she knew, something that had sustained her through the hardest times in her life, after her husband died, when her daughter got sick, when money was tight. In the kitchen, Dorothy had always found a way to create something nourishing from whatever was available. The sound of voices in the hallway brought her back to the present. The senator and Catherine were arguing again. You can't keep living off the family name, the senator was saying. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet. Like you did. Catherine's voice was cutting. Grandpa's money paid for your first campaign, and Mom's family connections got you the donors. That was different. I had a plan, a vision for what? Power? Another term in office? What about people who really need help? Their voices faded as they moved away from the kitchen. Dorothy kept working, pushing aside the family drama. The chicken was roasting now, filling the kitchen with a mouth-watering aroma of herbs and butter. She tasted the sauce, adjusting the seasoning with a practiced hand. The kitchen assistants returned with the herbs, confused to find Dorothy in charge. Mr. Laurent is ill, she explained. I'm handling dinner tonight. The younger assistant looked skeptical. But the senator's guests will have a fine meal, Dorothy finished firmly. Now I need you to wash and chop these herbs very finely. As 7:00 approached, Dorothy heard the sounds of guests arriving. Car doors slamming, greetings in the foyer, the clink of ice in cocktail glasses. She plated the first course with care, arranging a small garnish just so. It's time, said the older assistant, looking nervous. Dorothy nodded, removing her apron and smoothing her uniform. Serve the soup, she instructed. I'll finish preparing the main course. From the dining room came the murmur of conversation. The senator's deep voice carried occasionally confident, practiced, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Dorothy recognized the governor's distinctive laugh and the more reserved tones of his wife. The first course was served without incident. Dorothy watched anxiously as the plates returned to the kitchen, all empty. A good sign. She finished plating the main course, her signature dish, arranging each element with the care of an artist. "They're ready for the next course," said the assistant, returning from the dining room. Dorothy nodded, and the plates were carried out. She used the brief lull to start on dessert, working quickly but methodically. The cobbler was already baked and cooling. Now she needed to prepare the cream and the presentation. The kitchen door swung open. It was Catherine, looking flushed and slightly disheveled. "Dorothy," she said, glancing around the kitchen, "where's Laurent?" "He's ill, Miss Catherine, lying down in the staff room." Catherine's eyes widened as she took in the scene: Dorothy cooking, the assistants following her instructions. "Then who made that chicken? Everyone's raving about it." Dorothy hesitated. Mrs. Harrison had been clear that the senator wasn't to know. "The meal is being taken care of, miss." Catherine stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You made it, didn't you?" When Dorothy didn't immediately deny it, Catherine laughed. "Oh, this is rich. Dad's in there pontificating about his chef's genius to the governor, and it's actually our maids cooking they're all praising." "Miss Catherine, please, do you know what they're saying? The governor called it the best meal he's had at a political function in 20 years. Catherine's tone was hard to read, part amusement, part something else. "Mom knows, doesn't she?" Dorothy nodded reluctantly. "But not Dad." Catherine smiled slowly. "Interesting." Before Dorothy could respond, Catherine turned and left the kitchen. Dorothy felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She'd worked for powerful families long enough to recognize the signs of brewing trouble. She turned her attention back to dessert, trying to focus on the task at hand. The cobbler was perfectly golden, the peaches tender but not mushy. She prepared the bourbon vanilla cream, whipping it to soft peaks and adding just a touch of the premium bourbon the senator kept for special occasions. As she was putting the finishing touches on the dessert plates, she heard the dining room door open and Catherine's voice, unnaturally loud. "Actually, Governor, I think we should acknowledge the real chef responsible for tonight's magnificent dinner." Dorothy froze. The kitchen assistants looked at her with wide eyes. "Catherine, what are you talking about?" The senator's voice, confused and slightly irritated. "Laurent is ill," Catherine continued. "He hasn't cooked a thing tonight." A brief silence, then Mrs. Harrison's voice, tight with suppressed anger. "Catherine, this isn't the time. Then who prepared this meal?" the governor's wife asked, sounding genuinely curious. Dorothy could almost picture Catherine's triumphant smile as she answered, "Our maid, Dorothy." Another silence, longer this time. Dorothy set down the dessert she was garnishing, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Fetch her," the senator said at last, his tone unreadable. The younger assistant looked at Dorothy with sympathy. "The senator wants to see you in the dining room." Dorothy removed her apron again and smoothed her hair. She took a deep breath and walked toward the dining room, her heart pounding. "And that brings us back to where we started," Dorothy standing in the doorway of the elegant dining room, facing a table of powerful people, the senator demanding confirmation that she had prepared their meal. "Yes, sir," Dorothy had said. "Mr. Laurent collapsed in the kitchen. Food poisoning, I think." "There wasn't time to call anyone else. I couldn't let you be embarrassed in front of the governor." The senator's daughter had stood up suddenly, knocking over her wine glass. "Dad, you can't possibly," but the senator silenced her with a raised hand. The governor broke the tense silence. "Harrison, this is the finest meal I've had in 20 years of political dinners." He turned to Dorothy. "Who taught you to cook like this, ma'am?" Before Dorothy could answer, Mrs. Harrison spoke. "James, there's something you need to know, something I've kept from you for 30 years. She looked directly at Dorothy, tears forming in her eyes. "Something that changes everything." The room went completely still. Even Catherine looked surprised by her mother's words. Mrs. Harrison stood, her composure intact despite the tears threatening to spill. "Dorothy Wilson isn't just our maid. She was the head chef at the Magnolia Club in 1980. The senator's eyebrows shot up. The Magnolia Club. But that was the most exclusive restaurant in the state. "Yes," Mrs. Harrison continued. "Before that, she trained in Paris. She won regional awards. She was written up in Southern Living magazine." Dorothy stared at Mrs. Harrison, bewildered. How did she know all this? The senator turned to Dorothy. "Is this true?" Dorothy nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, though it was 1978 when I was at the Magnolia, not 1980. "But why didn't you ever mention this?" the senator asked. "We would have what, James?" Mrs. Harrison interrupted. "Paid her more, given her different work. The truth is, when Dorothy applied to work for us 7 years ago, you said we didn't need another cook. We needed a maid." The senator looked uncomfortable. "Well, yes, but if I'd known her qualifications, you knew," Mrs. Harrison said quietly. "I showed you her resume. You glanced at it and said, 'She's overqualified, but if she wants to clean houses at her age, that's her business.' If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this." The dining room fell silent again. Dorothy felt everyone's eyes on her, and she resisted the urge to look down or away. She'd spent too many years being invisible. "I remember you now," the governor said suddenly. "Dorothy Wilson, you catered my first inauguration." People talked about that meal for months. Dorothy smiled slightly. "Thank you, Governor, that was a special day." "But why leave professional cooking?" the governor's wife asked. "With your talent." Dorothy considered how to answer. The full story was long and complicated, involving racism in elite kitchens, a sick daughter who needed more of her time, and financial pressures that made steady work as a domestic employee more practical than the volatile restaurant industry. "Life takes unexpected turns, ma'am," she said simply. The senator was still processing his wife's revelation. "Elizabeth, why are you only telling me this now?" Mrs. Harrison Elizabeth looked at her husband with a complicated expression. "Because for 30 years, I've watched you overlook talented people if they don't fit your idea of what success looks like. Because tonight, the governor and everyone at this table experienced Dorothy's exceptional skill firsthand without prejudgment." She took a breath. "And because I'm tired of pretending I don't notice." The state attorney general, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "If I may, Senator, Mrs. Wilson's cooking tonight was extraordinary. In fact," he hesitated, then continued, "my wife and I are opening a small restaurant next month. Nothing fancy, just good food in a comfortable setting. We've been looking for a chef consultant." Dorothy looked at him in surprise. "It would be part-time," he added. "Advisory role, helping develop the menu, training the kitchen staff. We'd pay competitively, of course." Before Dorothy could respond, Catherine spoke up. "She already has a job with us." Her tone was defensive, almost possessive. "Actually," Dorothy said carefully, "I've been thinking about retirement. My grandson graduates next year and my knees aren't what they used to be." The senator finally found his voice again. "Dorothy, I owe you an apology. It seems I've underestimated you for years." Dorothy had never heard Senator Harrison apologize to anyone, let alone staff. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. "No need for apologies, Senator," Dorothy said. "You've been a fair employer, paid on time, provided health insurance. That's more than most." "But not equal to your worth," Mrs. Harrison said firmly. Catherine was watching her parents with an odd expression. "So you both knew Dorothy was overqualified all these years and said nothing?" "Dad because he didn't care and Mom because—" "What, you were making some kind of point?" "Catherine," the senator warned. "No, she's right to ask," Mrs. Harrison said. "I said nothing because I was a coward, because speaking up meant confronting not just your father's prejudices, but my own complicity." She looked at Dorothy. "I've failed you and I'm deeply sorry." Dorothy hadn't expected the evening to take this turn. She'd anticipated anger from the senator, perhaps even dismissal. "Not apologies and job offers. The dessert," she said, changing the subject. "It's waiting in the kitchen." "I'll help you," Catherine said unexpectedly, standing up. In the kitchen, as they plated the peach cobbler and bourbon vanilla cream, Catherine spoke in a low voice. "I didn't know about your background." "It wasn't relevant to my job here," Dorothy replied, "but it should have been." Catherine seemed genuinely troubled. "I grew up in this house. I saw how hard you worked. I never questioned anything." Dorothy looked at the younger woman thoughtfully. Despite her privileged upbringing, Catherine had always shown flashes of genuine concern for others. It was one of the reasons her current unhappiness troubled Dorothy. "Miss Catherine, we all have our blind spots." "Don't make excuses for me," Catherine said sharply. "I'm 30 years old. I should have seen more clearly." She carefully added a mint garnish to each dessert plate. "You know that charity I've been trying to start?" "The one Dad calls my latest whim?" Dorothy nodded. Catherine had mentioned it several times over the past months. "It's a culinary training program for underprivileged women, giving them skills for career advancement." Catherine looked directly at Dorothy. "Would you consider being involved, not as a maid, but as a teacher, a mentor?" For the second time that evening, Dorothy found herself speechless. "You don't have to answer now," Catherine added quickly. "Just think about it." They returned to the dining room with the desserts. The conversation had shifted to lighter topics, but Dorothy could feel a change in the atmosphere. The way the governor addressed her directly, the newfound respect in the senator's gaze, the thoughtful looks from the other guests. As they enjoyed her peach cobbler, Dorothy realized something important was happening, not just for her but for everyone in that room. Perceptions were shifting. Assumptions were being questioned. New possibilities were emerging. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with a warmth and authenticity rarely seen at the Harrison table. The governor shared stories from his early career before politics. The senator spoke about his childhood on his grandfather's farm. Even Mrs. Harrison revealed a side of herself Dorothy had never witnessed, passionate about education reform, knowledgeable about food history. After dessert, as coffee was served, the senator made his announcement. "Dorothy, I'd like to offer you a choice." His tone was formal but sincere. "You can continue working for us in any capacity you wish as our chef if that's what you want. Or if you prefer to pursue other opportunities like the Attorney General's offer, I'll provide a generous retirement package, including continuing health coverage." Dorothy looked around the table. 7 faces watched her expectantly. For decades, she had been in rooms like this, present but invisible, serving but not served, listening but not heard. Now suddenly she was the center of attention, her skills recognized, her knowledge valued, her future being discussed as something of importance. "I appreciate the offers," she said carefully, "but I'll need some time to consider my options." She turned to Catherine, "Including your proposal about the culinary program." Catherine beamed. The governor raised his coffee cup. "To Dorothy Wilson, an artist whose canvas is the plate and whose medium is flavor, we're fortunate to have experienced your work tonight." "To Dorothy," the others echoed, raising their cups. As the evening drew to a close, Dorothy began clearing the dessert plates. Mrs. Harrison touched her arm gently. "Not tonight," she said. "You're our honored guest now. Please join us in the living room." Dorothy hesitated, years of habits and boundaries difficult to set aside. But then she nodded, removing her serving apron. "Just let me check on Mr. Laurent first," she said. In the staff room, she found the chef sleeping, his fever broken. He opened his eyes when she entered. "How bad was it?" he asked hoarsely. Dorothy smiled. "Not bad at all. In fact, I think it was a success." "You saved him then, the senator." Laurent closed his eyes again. "He's lucky to have you." "Perhaps," Dorothy said, "but I'm beginning to think I deserve some luck of my own." She returned to the dining room where the senator was waiting to escort her to join the others. As they walked, he spoke quietly. "I built my career on being observant, Dorothy. On understanding people and situations." He shook his head. "Yet I failed to see what was right in front of me all these years." "We see what we expect to see, Senator," Dorothy replied. "We all do." "Not anymore," he said firmly. "Not if I can help it." In the living room, Dorothy took a seat among the distinguished guests. The conversation flowed around her politics and policy, yes, but also food and culture, history and community. For the first time in her long career in service, Dorothy was being served, not just coffee and cognac, but respect and recognition. As the evening drew to a close and the guests prepared to leave, the governor shook Dorothy's hand warmly. "Mrs. Wilson, would you do me the honor of cooking for the governor's mansion charity gala next month? Full creative control, your name on the menu, and top billing in all the press materials." Dorothy thought about what that would mean. Her name, her food, her vision, no longer hidden behind someone else's identity. At 62, a new beginning. "I would be delighted, Governor," she said. Later that night, after the guests had departed, Dorothy found herself alone in the kitchen with Mrs. Harrison. The senator and Catherine had gone to his study to discuss Catherine's culinary program in detail, a conversation that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. "I've wanted to tell him for years," Mrs. Harrison said quietly, helping Dorothy pack up leftovers, another first. "About you, about so many things." Dorothy nodded. "Fear is a powerful silencer." "Yes," Mrs. Harrison handed her a container. "But so is courage when we finally find it." She hesitated. "Whatever you decide about your future, Dorothy, I hope you know how much I admire you." Dorothy studied the woman she'd worked for all these years. Elizabeth Harrison had always been kind, if distant. Now Dorothy saw her clearly too, a woman who had made compromises, who had buried parts of herself to fit into the world she'd chosen, who was perhaps finding her own voice at last. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," Dorothy said, "for seeing me." "Elizabeth, please," Mrs. Harrison said. "I think we're past formalities now." Dorothy smiled. "Elizabeth, then." As Dorothy drove home that night in her old Buick, she thought about the unexpected turn her life had taken. One dinner, one crisis, one moment of truth had changed everything. Tomorrow, she would have choices to make, opportunities to consider, a future to reimagine. But tonight, as she pulled into the driveway of her modest home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the sweet satisfaction of being truly seen, of having her skills, her art recognized and celebrated, of standing in her full power and dignity. Dorothy Wilson, master chef. Dorothy Wilson, culinary educator. Dorothy Wilson, respected professional. She smiled to herself in the darkness of her car. Yes, she would have some decisions to make. But for now, she savored the moment, the night her cooking stunned a wealthy family and changed her fate forever. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.